Canada's moral values have changed substantially over the last number of decades. How did this happen, and what were the contributing factors? And is it possible to turn things around? Today's guest joins us from Tillsonburg, Ontario, Jonathon Van Maren. He is the host of the Bridgehead podcast, and he's an author, newspaper columnist, international speaker, and activist. His latest book is How We Got Here, a guide to our anti-Christian culture. Jonathon, it's great to have you with us again.
It's great to be here.
So why don't we begin with where we are at right now when it comes to the moral state of Canada and our Western society? Give us a little bit of a rundown.
Well, I think anybody in Canada who picks up a newspaper will see debates happening that are incredibly recent. So, my mother, when she attended a Canadian public school, remembers the day being opened with the Lord's Prayer. Now you see the primary debates in multiple provinces right now being about whether or not a child can be referred for a sex change without his or her parents knowing it, about what kind of things can be taught to children. Can we teach LGBT education in schools, yes or no? Can we do it with the parents' knowledge or without their knowledge? We're seeing in Ontario that it's more controversial for a Roman Catholic school not to fly a transgender flag than it is for them to fly one. And we currently have a prime minister that campaigns at every opportunity on issues like abortion and is incredibly fixated on Canada's abortion regime, which permits abortion throughout all 9 months of pregnancy. And so the reason I called my book How We Got Here is because I've heard this question more times than I can count over the last 10 years, as people picking up the newspaper in Canada don't recognize the country they find in its pages.
And you start your book about writing about the sexual revolution. Just talk about a little bit about when and how did this start?
So the sexual revolution is incredibly important to understand because when we look at how things change, there's often the sense of inevitability that our culture is in a state of decline, that civilizations rise and fall, and we happen to be on the downswing. And so in order for Christians and really anybody to understand how we got to this point, we need to understand the historical chronology of how we went from a culture based on Judeo-Christian values to a culture based on the values of the sexual revolution. And the answer to that question is quite long and extensive because there's many different intellectuals who have shaped the views that we now see surging to the surface of our culture. So the idea of gender ideology, this idea that gender is a spectrum rather than a sex binary, was first invented about 120 years ago by a scholar named Magnus Hirschfeld, who never saw his views achieve the mainstream in his lifetime, but are now a standard point of debate, of course, in Alberta politics. We saw this recently with Premier Danielle Smith, with the Saskatchewan Premier Scott Moe. Even in Ontario, that debate is starting to take place. But I think for Canadians to get an easy understanding of how the sexual revolution came to Canada, it would be to look at the transformation of our country between the two Trudeaus. If I had to pick a political starting point in this country, it would be when Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau, the current Prime Minister's father, passed the Omnibus Bill in 1969, which decriminalized a range of sexual practices, inaugurated no-fault divorce, and decriminalized abortion. This, of course, was accompanied by a radical shift in what was being taught at universities, which groomed an entire generation into new values.
So a Trudeau is a Trudeau. And a significant part of the sexual revolution was the introduction of birth control, especially the pill. How did this impact our society?
Well, it's really interesting that you mention that because there have been multiple areas of sort of sexual libertinism throughout history, but these were confined by the reality that sex makes babies, as sex education once used to teach in public schools, and that if a society threw off all moral boundaries on sexuality, you would see essentially the breakdown of the social structure, which was founded on the institution of the family. But the sexual revolution, these new ideas were coming to fruition in the 60s and 70s, just as the birth control appeared on the scene. And so the reason the sexual revolution of the 60s and the 70s and beyond succeeded where previous attempts at sexual revolution failed is because there was this technology that promised, falsely as it turned out, that you could actually separate sex from procreation. And of course, because that was not the case, we saw every country where contraception and birth control became commonly used eventually legalize abortion about a decade later, because of course, babies are a result of sex. And when those babies are unwanted in a culture that practices sex recreationally, those babies end up being killed by abortionists in clinics that are in this country funded by our government.
And let's talk a little bit more about abortion because depending on what media you're looking at, there's some headlines out there that will show abortion as the leading cause of death worldwide by far. Now, other media will omit abortion as a cause of death, but it's still sobering that that abortion ranks so high as a leading cause of death. How did we get here?
This is a very, very salient point, and I'm glad you mentioned that piece of data specifically because in 2023, at least 42 million children were killed by abortion. Now, let's put this into context for a moment. Every developed nation right now is experiencing what's referred to as a baby bust. There's been a massive drop off in demographics. Again, the decision of people to avoid having children, to choose to stay single permanently, or to abort their children has resulted in populations that are not reproducing themselves, full stop. And nations without children fundamentally are nations without a future. And so we're seeing these crises hit virtually every Western nation and a number of non Western nations as well. And this is brought about by the sexual revolution. It was the idea that one could have sex without making babies and that birth control and contraception permitted people to do that. Now, of course, when people think they can do something without consequences, they practice that more, which actually resulted in more pregnancies rather than fewer. Over 50% of people who are going to have an abortion were actually using contraception when they got pregnant. And so, of course, there's a direct link between the catastrophic number of abortions happening globally every year and the crises that are now gripping almost every Western country. 42 million people is the average population of a country. So we're killing the average of about one country per year worldwide.
Now, it's interesting that you said that we're in a baby bust. Now, we have baby boomers out there. Why hasn't anyone coined the phrase baby busters and used that to describe Gen Y or Gen Z?
You know, some of your viewers might remember a book that came out around 2010 by Mark Stein called America Alone, The End of the World as We Know It, where he described the demographic crisis that was looming. And at the time, he was kind of laughed off by quite a few people. But what we're seeing recently now is that mainstream newspapers, even here in Canada, are tackling this almost incessantly. The Globe and Mail, the CBC, CTV, mainstream news sources are saying Canadians are not having children. Our population is shrinking. What does this lead to? Well, let me give you one salient example that addresses another issue I have a chapter on in my book. The children of a nation are the ones who grow up, become taxpayers, and pay into the social welfare system that many vulnerable Canadians depend on. When we do not have those taxpayers arriving on the scene and contributing to the system, we end up having an overloaded healthcare system that can simply no longer provide the services that vulnerable Canadians need. And so what you have when you have a baby bust and an abortion regime is inevitably euthanasia and assisted suicide, where in Canada, just during Trudeau's tenure, we've seen 60,000 Canadians die by euthanasia, over 15,000 last year. About half of those Canadians cited fear of being a burden as one of the reasons that they opted to die by lethal injection. And this is just another example of what happens when you're living in a culture that is increasingly opting for childlessness.
And your book tackles what you call the pornography pandemic. That's an interesting phrase to use, and the word pandemic. Explain why you chose that word, pandemic.
So I was using the word pandemic before we all went through the COVID pandemic. Okay. I find that now when I give presentations on pornography, it seems to be more triggering due to all the experiences everybody's had over the last couple of years.
Yeah.
I chose the word pandemic because a pandemic really refers to a virus that spreads like wildfire. And what we've seen with the advent of the smartphone in 2010 is the rates of pornography addiction soar through the roof. So in Canada, the average age of first exposure to pornography is around the age age of 9. The majority of young males consume pornography regularly. Now, a majority of young females do as well. They attempted to do a study at McGill University contrasting students who looked at porn and students who didn't. They had to cancel the study because they couldn't find any students who didn't look at porn. And this is fundamentally transforming the way Canadians view sex and intimacy, which we've seen in stories like the Jian Ghomeshi scandal, where he claimed that he was simply living out a 50 Shades of Grey lifestyle when 13 women accused him of sexual violence. And the Toronto Star, Canada's most liberal newspaper, said that Jian Ghomeshi has been accused of unwanted sexual violence, thereby implying there's such a thing as wanted sexual violence. This was brought to our country by the widespread use of pornography, and it is a crisis and it is a pandemic.
And you say that some national governments are now expressing concern over the violent nature of today's porn. Even in the U.S., we've seen, like especially in Florida, we've seen government cracking down on it.
It's a great point because 10 years ago, when I was debating this issue on the radio or at universities, people would kind of write you off as sort of a Christian prude. Now, the view that pornography drives the rates of sexual violence up and that pornography is deforming the minds of a generation is a view held by the government of the UK. It's a view held by the governments of multiple states who are passing laws to prevent minors from accessing porn. It's a view held by the Attorney General of France, who advocated for prosecuting pornography. I could give you a list of another dozen countries, but this is a secular consensus now that pornography and its widespread usage is deforming the minds of a generation, and that this is fusing violence and intimacy together in a way we've only just begun to grapple with.
And you express a lot of concern for our public health education system as well. Who is teaching our kids and what is being taught?
Well, that's one of the most interesting ways that I think the average Canadian has woken up to the reality that everything has changed in this country. That in 2025, we are not the country we were 20 years ago, because now children are being taught at the very youngest ages that there are up to 72 genders. You have the SOGI education in BC. You had the sex education implemented by the Rachel Notley government in Alberta. You have similar education in Ontario and right across the country. And these children are essentially being taught a version of anti-reality, that they can choose their own gender, that, for example, if they have traditionally tomboy type characteristics, this probably means they're transgender or born in the right body. And then they're being introduced to various sexual practices at very young ages. There have been scandals very recently in the last couple of months in Saskatchewan and other provinces where children were being taught very, very graphic and explicit, detailed how-to sex manuals on a variety of activities, many of them which I cannot mention on air, but all of them, I assure you, regardless of whether you're a Christian or secular, you would find horrifying to discover it was being taught to children as young as 10.
And this isn't just coming from our schools. This is also coming from social media. It's coming from Hollywood. It's coming from our TV shows, our movies. Talk a bit about the impact that social media and Hollywood has on us and our children.
Well, human beings are fundamentally people who define themselves by stories. And again, now the story of Western civilization is the story of the sexual revolution. And what we see is Hollywood telling those stories. The heroes of Hollywood are now the kinds of activists who pushed that. It's LGBT activists like Harvey Milk. It's abortion activists like Gloria Steinem. The companies of big tech, by and large, have been firmly co-opted by massive LGBT lobby organizations like GLAAD or the Human Rights Campaign. And so they promote Pride Month, which is in June. If you live in Canada, the Trudeau government now says we have a Pride season, which is June, July, August, and September, according to the Canadian government website. And so what we're seeing is the story put forward by the sexual revolutionaries, pumped out across social media platforms, told by the most talented and wealthy storytellers of our generation, and a generation of young people between schools, universities, social media, and Hollywood. They're absorbing that story as their own story.
Wow, I didn't even know we had a Pride season now. I just thought it was called summer. Now,
You're paying for it.
Where do you see our culture headed over the next decade, and what can we do to take a stand for what's right?
So there's a couple of different ways. In chapter 11 of my book, I describe how we need to create thick Christian communities where we are passing our values on to our children. We are sharing our stories and the Christian story with them so that they have an identity that is separate from the sexual revolutionary identity put forward by the culture. Where do I think we're going in the next decade? I think that we're seeing some real signs for optimism. I think the fact that the Trudeau government attempted to expand eligibility of euthanasia to those suffering from mental illness, that this was delayed twice and then halted, and that a conservative government would ban it is really encouraging in terms of protecting the vulnerable. I think the fact that Canadians born after 1988 are far more likely to be against abortion morally in almost all cases is an incredibly encouraging trajectory. I also think what's going on in Alberta right now with Danielle Smith's legislation protecting minors from sex change surgeries is really encouraging, and I suspect we'll see more of it in the years to come.
Jonathon Van Maren is the host of the Bridgehead podcast and author of How We Got Here. Jonathon, thanks so much for being with us today.
Thank you so much for taking the time.